Hey guys, today's story takes us back to a time before comfort, to the frozen heart of North America. A time when men faced mountains, not for fame, but for survival. They weren't heroes, they weren't legends, they were wanderers, trappers, and outcasts. Men who looked at the wilderness and thought, maybe this is where I belong. But the mountain doesn't welcome anyone. It simply watches and waits. Before we dive in, make sure you're part of the journey. Hit that subscribe button to join the Story Vault, where history breathes and the past still has a pulse. Now, let's step into the silence and begin the story. They were the kind of men who looked at the edge of a map and said, let's see what's past that terrible idea. Most were failed farmers, restless soldiers, or men who'd simply exhausted civilization's patience. The cities were too loud, too structured, too full of people telling them what to do. So, they packed up their regrets, slung a rifle over their shoulder, and walked straight into winter, a place where bad decisions froze faster than water. In the early 1800s, the frontier whispered promises of fortune. The fur trade was booming, or at least survivable. Riches meant one thing, not starving to death while chasing beavers through waist-deep snow. The job description was simple: 6 months in the mountains, get frostbite, and hopefully come back with something that didn't smell like regret. Their life expectancy, about one bad campfire away from zero. There were no inns, no hot drinks, no forecasts, just a man, his rifle, and the quiet realization that he might have made a terrible mistake. When the wind screamed through the trees at night, it didn't sound poetic. It sounded like the world laughing at them. Their relationship with the cold wasn't emotional, it was personal. You didn't fight it, you negotiated with it. You built a fire from frozen wood, huddled over it like a philosopher with a death wish, and prayed the wind didn't change its mind. If it did, your warmth turned into smoke, and your hope followed. They ate things that would make a raccoon reconsider its diet. Beaver tails, marrow, meat so old it could apply for citizenship. Gourmet meant it didn't crunch when it wasn't supposed to. But calories were life, and life didn't care about taste. And yet, somehow, they stayed. Because out there, beyond the noise and judgment of civilization, was something rare. Silence. Not peace, not comfort. Just the kind of silence that made you realize how small you were and how stupid you'd been to come here. It was humbling, maybe spiritual. Mostly, it was just cold. Modern folks panic when the power goes out for 2 hours. The mountain men would have called that a cozy evening. They weren't clean, comfortable, or safe, but they were alive. And in their frostbitten logic, that counted as victory. They weren't built different, they were just built colder. The laws of the cold. The first truth every mountain man learned, usually after losing a finger, was that the cold doesn't hate you. It simply doesn't care if you survive. You can't threaten it, bribe it, or plead with it. You can scream into the wind all night if you want. The wind won't answer. City people think you can beat the weather by a heated jacket. Move to Florida. The mountain men knew better. You don't beat weather. You survive its mood swings. They learned that standing chest deep in snow, flint in one hand and regret in the other. The cold didn't punish stupidity, it just waited for it. They could always spot newcomers, the fresh-faced dreamers who thought a wool coat was enough. By sundown, they were cursing the snow, like poets on their last chapter. The old trappers didn't bother. You only curse what listens. Frostbite wasn't an if, it was a when. Ears, fingers, noses, They all had expiration dates. No one complained. You just learned to do things left-handed. Pain was temporary. Stupidity was fatal. When your beard froze stiff and your coffee turned to ice mid-pour, that wasn't a bad morning. That was normal. They didn't need thermometers. They had their own system. If the whiskey froze, build another fire. If you froze, well, lesson learned. That's what separated them from the rest of us. We think cold is an inconvenience. They knew it was law. They didn't fight it. They adapted until even the frost couldn't tell if they were alive or part of the landscape. Because the truth the mountains live by is simple. The cold doesn't care. It just waits. The white silence in the mountains. Quiet isn't peace. It's a warning. They learned to read that silence like scripture. The way your breath hung in the air told you how close death felt that day. The world was one long, unbroken whisper. Snow, wind, and the sound of your stomach regretting last night's dinner. They called it the white silence, not because it was beautiful, but because it was absolute. You could scream into it, and your echo would die faster than a fire in a blizzard. The mountains didn't care about your feelings. They demanded obedience. Those who didn't listen became stories told around someone else's fire. A mountain man could read snow like a scientist reads data. If it squeaked underfoot, the cold was serious. If it crunched, you could live with it. If it made no sound at all, congratulations, you were in trouble. They could smell storms before they arrived, taste ice in the air, and feel pressure shifts in their bones. We open weather apps. They were weather apps. They knew how to walk through snow without sinking, how to build a fire that wouldn't choke itself, and how to find shelter by watching shadows. You didn't wonder, you observed. A shift in the wind meant a storm was planning something personal. A sudden silence in the forest meant something was considering you for dinner. Even the animals paid attention. When crows flew low, snow was on the way. When wolves went quiet, it was already there. They didn't survive because they were tougher. They survived because they noticed. The wilderness rewarded respect and devoured arrogance. You can't learn that kind of awareness from a podcast. You learn it spending 3 nights in a snowstorm, chewing frozen jerky, and realizing nature doesn't do refunds. The mountain men didn't conquer the white silence. They just learned to whisper back. The currency of heat for a mountain man, warmth, wasn't comfort. It was currency. Every spark, every ember, every stubborn flame was a paycheck from the universe saying, "Congratulations, you live another hour." Modern people treat heat like a right. Mountain men treated it like a miracle. Their turning up the heat involved flint, frozen fingers, and the deep suspicion that God had a sense of humor. Making fire in a blizzard wasn't a skill. It was an argument with nature, and nature always won on points. They carried tinder like treasure, bits of bark, dry moss, or scraps of cloth that hadn't frozen solid yet. They knew exactly how long a single log would burn, how fast snow could bury a flame, and how many curses it took before smoke turned into fire. On average, 7. When that first flicker of orange finally appeared, it felt holy. But fire wasn't just warmth, it was company. A campfire was the only voice that ever answered back, crackling, hissing, throwing light into a world that wanted you gone. Sitting near it, wrapped in hides, you didn't think about philosophy or poetry. You thought about how long it would last, and whether your boots would ignite before your toes froze off. Fire taught efficiency. You cooked everything on coals, meat, snow, and optimism. Coffee froze before you could drink it, so you ate it like a popsicle and called it frontier style. They didn't seek glory, they didn't find comfort, but they did something rarer. They endured, because in the mountains, the only thing colder than the wind was the silence that followed it. They knew warmth was a fragile miracle, something you earned twice, once with sweat and once with smoke. Get careless, and the wind took it. Sleep too close, and the sparks took you. Fire didn't forgive mistakes. It demanded respect, same as the cold. When nights grew longer than sanity, and the temperature fell past reason, mountain men didn't pray for warmth. They built it. They didn't expect comfort. They manufactured survival. That's what set them apart from the rest of us. We live surrounded by heat and still complain about being cold. They lived inside winter and called it another evening. In the mountains, bravery meant nothing without insulation, both on your body and in your mind. A mountain man learned fast. The best way to survive was to dress like a bear and think like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead yet. First came the wool shirt, sometimes regret, then the vest, the coat, and finally a layer of fur thick enough to qualify as another person. By the end of winter, most of them looked like furniture that had learned to walk. Washing those layers, unthinkable. Soap froze. Water froze. Even the idea of cleanliness froze. Their smell was legendary, a mix of sweat, smoke, animal fat, and regret. You could track a mountain man long before you saw him. Wolves usually did, and wisely went the other way. Every piece of clothing told a story. A burn mark from a fire that got too friendly. A torn seam from a fall that ended in profanity. Their wardrobe wasn't fashion. It was a diary of survival. But those layers were more than fabric. They were armor against madness. When weeks of silence stretched on and your only conversation was with your echo, the weight on your shoulders reminded you that you still existed. The fur, the smell, the constant discomfort, it all kept you tethered to something real. However miserable that reality was. Modern people talk about winter fashion. Mountain men talked about not dying. They didn't wear brands. They wore whatever hadn't been eaten yet. The richer trappers might have had fringed coats and fancy moccasins, but underneath they were all the same cold, filthy philosophers, mumbling about firewood and fate. And when spring finally melted the snow, they'd peel off those layers like bark, revealing a pale, half-starved man underneath, blinking, dazed, and wondering why he ever left a warm bed. Yet somehow, when winter came back, so did they. Because survival wasn't comfortable, it was addictive. Food wasn't pleasure, it was physics. Calories were fuel, not flavor. If it burned, it worked. If it didn't, you died slightly more poetically. Dinner was whatever didn't kill you first. They roasted, boiled, or simply gnawed on whatever moved slower than they did. Beaver tail was a delicacy. Elk tongue was a luxury. Everything else was just fuel with fur attached. Fat was gold. Meat was a means to keep breathing. When the week was good, you got rabbit stew. When it wasn't, you might eat the same rabbit twice. Jerky was dinner, dessert, and dental hazard in one. It could break your teeth, not that anyone cared, because dentistry back then was called "don't get infected." They hunted in silence, not out of respect for nature, but because chewing too loud could scare off dinner. A missed shot wasn't failure. It was a week of hunger and regret. Every part of the animal was used. Bones for broth, hides for shelter, sinew for stitching. Even the smell was a deterrent, a natural way to to keep company away. Salt was precious. You didn't season for taste, you seasoned for survival. Their only spice blend was desperation mixed with soot. When food ran out, imagination took over. They ate their horses, their belts, and in truly desperate times, the boiled soles of their boots. They called it leather soup. They probably called it other things too, but language tends to break down when you're chewing footwear. There was no farm to table. Everything was catch it before it freezes. Coffee came from roasted chicory. Whiskey was medicine disguised as happiness. Today, people count calories. Back then, mountain men counted hours between meals. If it kept you warm, it was good. If it didn't, you wouldn't be around to complain. They didn't eat to live well. They ate to keep living, which, in their world, was ambitious enough. When the day ended, if it ended, they gathered around the only luxury they had, a fire that refused to die as stubbornly as they did. That flicker of orange wasn't just warmth, it was civilization concentrated into one trembling circle of smoke and survival. They didn't talk much during the day. The wind was too loud and work too constant. But at night, when the snow whispered just beyond the firelight, words crawled out. That's when the philosophy started. Rough, simple, unfiltered truths born from frost and fatigue. One man might mutter, "Ain't nothing colder than regret," and another would nod, not because it made sense, but because everything made sense after the third sip of whiskey. Every spark was a sermon, every crackle a reminder that warmth was temporary. They'd talk about women, whiskey, and weather, and how all three could kill you if you weren't paying attention. Then silence would take over. Not peaceful silence, the kind that pressed against your ribs until you remembered how alone you really were. The fire became their companion, their witness, their confession booth. It didn't judge, it didn't answer. It just burned until it decided not to. Each man had his ritual. Some poked the fire endlessly, desperate to keep it breathing. Others sat motionless, hypnotized, like they were staring at the last light left in the world. Philosophy, for them, wasn't about ideas, it was about endurance. You didn't ask about the meaning of life, you asked whether your fingers still worked. Enlightenment was a dry pair of socks and a full belly. The fire didn't fix their problems, it just reminded them they still had them. But in that tiny circle of light, for a few short hours, the universe made smoky, flickering sense. For the mountain men, sleep wasn't rest, it was a ceasefire with death. You didn't go to bed, you just stopped moving and hoped nothing large, hungry or cold, noticed. They slept in caves, under trees, or buried in snow, like stubborn animals refusing to die. If you had one fur blanket, you were lucky. It meant you were sharing them with fleas that had squatters' rights. Comfort didn't exist. It was a luxury for people who'd never had to earn their warmth. The fire was your roommate, unpredictable and occasionally homicidal. It either died too early or burned too high and tried to take you with it. You learned to sleep close enough to stay alive, but far enough to keep your boots from melting. The night air didn't whisper, it bit. It crawled into your bones like it was paying rent. You could wear every hide you owned and still feel the cold breathing through the seams. The mountain didn't want you dead. It just wanted to see how close it could get. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between shivers. 20 minutes here, a curse there, a quick adjustment of furs, and repeat. Dreaming was dangerous. Get too comfortable, and you froze before the sequel. Sometimes desperation made you creative. A snowbank became a bed, a saddle, a pillow, a half-dead horse, a heated mattress for as long as it lasted. The smell was the least of your problems. Aesthetics die fast when frostbite starts taking attendance. And in the morning, if there was a morning, you didn't check the time. You checked your pulse. If you could still feel your nose, it was going to be a good day. If you couldn't, well, at least there'd be less face to shave. They didn't sleep because they were tired. They slept because there was nothing else left to do. Night wasn't for dreaming. It was for surviving, quietly, one heartbeat at a time, until the sun decided to try again. For mountain men, sleep wasn't peace, it was maintenance. In the mountains, your tools decided whether you lived, died, or simply wished you had. There wasn't room for weak metal or weaker men. Each man carried what amounted to a traveling hardware store and a mild death wish, a rifle, a knife, a handful of traps, and the blind optimism that none of it would break. Rifles misfired in the cold. Knives chipped on frozen bone. Traps caught everything except what they were meant to. Fixing them took skill, creativity, and an advanced degree in swearing. You couldn't buy replacements. There were no stores, no mail orders, no friendly blacksmith waiting behind the next snowdrift. You just patched it with sinew, bark, or blind faith, and kept moving. A hatchet wasn't just a tool, it was a belief system. You chopped wood, built shelter, carved stakes, and occasionally used it to express strong opinions. Flint and steel were sacred. Lose them, and you were sentenced to a diet of raw meat and regret. Leather cord, animal sinew, frozen rope. These weren't supplies, they were lifelines. You could spot a veteran trapper by the way his gear looked like it had survived a brawl with the wilderness. Everything was patched, bent, or slightly on fire. If it worked, it was good. If it didn't, you called it innovation. But the most important tool they carried wasn't tea in their hands. It was in their heads. Tolerance for pain, for hunger, for the absurdity of staying alive out here. A mountain man could lose a finger, burn his hand, and still finish skinning an elk, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led to panic. Modern people panic when their phone battery dies. A mountain man's version of low battery was running out of bullets, while something with claws jogged toward him. He didn't overthink, he didn't complain. He fixed it, adapted, or accepted that nature had won again on points. Everything they owned was temporary, borrowed from the land. Metal rusted, leather rotted, fire burned out. But their patience, that was permanent. Their tools broke, their tempers frayed, but their endurance never did. That kind of durability doesn't come from factories. It comes from frostbite and stubbornness. In the mountains, the body was the only teacher, and it didn't believe in gentle lessons. You didn't train for the cold. You survived it until your blood learned the syllabus. Every day was a biology experiment conducted by someone who dropped out of school at Ouch. Newcomers fought the cold, stomping, swearing, layering themselves in denial. But veterans knew better. The body adapts faster than the brain. The mind screams, "This is insane." But the flesh quietly evolves, learning to sleep on ice and call it refreshing. After a few winters, your skin grew tougher than the leather you wore. Nerves dulled. Pain turned into background noise. You stopped checking if you were bleeding. The answer was always yes. Fingers became tools. Feet became hooves. You stopped being a man and started being a semi-domesticated animal with a drinking problem. They never talked about mental resilience that required feelings and most of those froze off long ago. So they just kept moving. The body learned efficiency through punishment, how to breathe slow so your lungs didn't bite back, how to walk without wasting energy, how to sleep without actually relaxing. Cold exposure rewired everything: your metabolism, your sanity, your definition of fine. A seasoned trapper could sit for hours in the snow, motionless, a statue carved from frost and regret. He didn't fidget, he didn't blink. He'd reached something close to enlightenment through hypothermia. The cold didn't toughen them, it sculpted them. Weakness didn't vanish, it simply stopped being an option. Strength wasn't a choice, it was a consequence. They didn't set out to be tough, they just never got around to dying. Modern people call that grit. Mountain men called it Tuesday. Their bodies learned long before their minds ever caught up. By the time understanding arrived, the lesson was already written in scars. Pain wasn't a symptom, it was part of the weather. You didn't ask if it would hurt, only what kind of hurt you get today. Everything out here had teeth, claws, or sharp edges, including your own boots. The cold cracked your skin, the wind peeled your face. Every muscle protested like it wanted to file a complaint. But pain wasn't the enemy. It was background noise, like the wind, or loneliness, or wolves arguing over what was left of your dinner. Cuts festered, fingers blackened, joints swelled. You fixed it the old-fashioned way: whiskey and denial. If it didn't kill you, it was fine. If it did, well, at least you didn't have to wake up early. There were no doctors, no bandages, no sympathy. You cauterized wounds, spat on burns, and kept moving, because the snow didn't care about your bad day. Aching bones were medals. Frostbite was a handshake. You compared scars like other men compared trophies. Pain simplified things. It stripped away luxury, distraction, and introspection. When everything hurts, philosophy feels optional. They didn't complain because no one would listen, and even if someone did, what was there to say? It's cold. Of course it's cold. That's the point. Pain was proof you were still alive. Numbness meant you were losing. Modern people call mild discomfort burnout. Mountain men's burnout involved actual fire. We complain about stiff backs from office chairs. They slept on frozen dirt and called it a chiropractic adjustment. They lived in a constant tug-of-war between agony and apathy, too cold to feel, too stubborn to stop. Pain wasn't punishment, it was a reminder. You were still here, still breathing, still annoying the wilderness by refusing to die quietly. And in a world that never apologized, mountain men learned the oldest truth of all. Pain isn't the enemy. It's the only honest thing the cold ever gives you. Solitude was their constant companion, loud, moody, and always present when you least wanted it. For months, the only heartbeat you heard was your own, and even that one sounded tired. Out there, conversation was optional, mostly because anyone left to talk to had probably frozen solid. Your best friends were your horse, your dog, and your rifle, not necessarily in that order. The horse carried your gear and judged your decisions. The dog shared your fire and occasionally your dinner. The rifle made sure neither of you became dinner. It was a balanced, codependent triangle, part survival, part insanity. Men could go entire seasons without hearing another human voice. They'd start talking to themselves until even their own echo started sounding like a stranger. You learned to argue with yourself and lose. Loneliness wasn't poetic, it was hunger, the kind that chewed from the inside. Eventually, you started naming things, your traps, your boots, your fire, because eventually something needed to answer back. Some men cracked under the silence. It was too wide, too endless, a kind of emptiness that pressed against your skull until you started hearing things, whispers in the wind, footsteps just beyond the firelight. Maybe they were real. Maybe that's just what happens when your only social life consists of wolves and ghosts. Out here, animals were the closest thing to companionship. A horse's breath steaming in the dark could feel like proof the world had ended. And a good dog that was everything, hunter, guard, heater, therapist. Lose him, and you might as well dig 2 holes, one for him and one for your sanity. The wild didn't care about your loneliness, but it taught you to listen differently. You learned to read the forest like a language, movement in the trees, tone in the wind, rhythm in the snow. Every sound meant something. Every silence meant more. Back east, men measured success in gold and land. In the mountains, you measured it in company. A fire that stayed lit, a horse that didn't wander off, a dog that still wagged his tail when you muttered something stupid into the dark. When the nearest human was 100 miles away, even a grunt from a mule counted as good conversation. Out here, fire wasn't a luxury. It was civilization, sanity, insurance against becoming a historical curiosity. Every spark was a miracle, and every man who made one felt like a god for about 5 minutes, right until it went out again. Lighting a fire in good weather was easy. Lighting one in a blizzard, that was performance art. You fought frozen wood, frozen hands, and your own frozen optimism. It wasn't skill that kept the flame alive. It was stubbornness. You didn't make fire because you thought you could. You made it because dying was less convenient. They carried flint and steel like holy relics. Some men kept a live coal wrapped in moss against their chest for miles, guarding it like a heartbeat. Lose it, and you spend the night regretting it, or cremating yourself by accident, trying to start another. Wet wood was nature's insult. You cursed, shaved bark, and blew until your lungs gave up before your fire did. And when it finally caught that first flicker of orange in the dark, you didn't look away. You stared at it like an old friend come back from the dead. Fire wasn't just heat, it was company, comfort, and the only form of therapy the mountains offered. Too small, and it mocked you. Too big, and it tried to kill you. You learned to read flames like moods, the hiss of damp wood, the pop of success, the whoosh of there goes my gloves. Fire made food edible. It made fear manageable. It made nights survivable. It was a teacher, too. Get lazy, and it vanished. Get careless, and it punished. Fire didn't forgive. It just burned. Every mountain man had his own ritual. Some whispered to it. Others fed it carefully, like it was alive, because, in a way, it was. In that frozen world, it was the only thing that truly was. Sitting beside it, your back cold, your face burning, you remembered just how fragile warmth really was. Civilization began with fire. Out here, it ended with it. They didn't have thermostats. They had survival. Somewhere along the line, we traded one for the other. We forgot that warmth used to mean work, that staying alive took more than remembering to pay the heating bill. They didn't fear discomfort. They bargained with it. The cold taught patience, humility, and how to build resilience, one frozen mistake at a time. We replaced that with electric blankets and motivational quotes about stepping outside your comfort zone, usually said by people sitting comfortably indoors. The mountain men knew the cold wasn't an enemy. It was a teacher, one that graded on a curve, where failure meant burial. But the lessons stuck. You learned to respect nature because it didn't care about excuses. These men could smell a blizzard coming. Today, most people need a weather app just to find their porch. They didn't panic when things went wrong. Things always went wrong. You fixed it or you froze. They didn't call it resilience. They called it Tuesday. And they didn't complain because nobody was listening, which, come to think of it, is probably why they got so much done. We forgot the difference between comfort and capability. We built a world where survival depends on Wi-Fi, delivery apps, and outrage. The mountain men depended on friction, fat, and fire. They worked for every meal, every degree of warmth, every breath that didn't freeze inside their lungs. The cold stripped away everything that wasn't real until only truth remained. You're not in control. You never were. Nature just lets you pretend sometimes. They didn't romanticize hardship. They didn't call it the simple life. It wasn't simple. It was brutal, lonely, indifferent, but it was real. We forgot that comfort doesn't build strength. It replaces it. The mountain men knew cold was life's default setting. Everything warm, safe, or easy was temporary, a privilege. And when the fire finally burned low and the frost crept back in, they didn't curse the cold. They just pulled the blanket tighter and said, "Figures." That wasn't despair. That was wisdom. By the mid-1800s, the age of the mountain men began to thaw, melting away like the snow they'd lived under for decades. The fur trade collapsed. Civilization crept west with its railroads, telegraphs, and too many people who thought frostbite was a myth. The wilderness was shrinking, and so were the men who had built their lives inside it. They didn't vanish all at once. They faded. Some became guides for settlers, muttering warnings nobody listened to. Others opened trading posts, selling overpriced coffee to people who called it adventure. And a few just walked deeper into the mountains and never came back, which honestly was the most poetic exit available. The world moved on. Warmth became easy. Comfort became normal. Survival became something that happened by accident. The same mountains that once tested men now hosted vacation lodges. People sitting by those fireplaces never realized they were staring into the ghost of a harder world, a world that demanded you earn every degree of heat. The mountain men understood something modern people still haven't. The cold isn't cruel, it's honest. It doesn't care who you are, what you believe, or how much insulation you can afford. It just asks one question: can you adapt? They answered that question the only way they knew how, by living long enough to become myths, and dying long enough to be forgotten. Their bones became part of the landscape. Their names faded into creeks and valleys. Their legacy flickered out like the last ember of a campfire left untended. But the lessons remain, buried under every snowfall, whispered in every gust that rattles a cabin door. The cold still speaks the same language. We've just stopped listening, because somewhere, deep in that frozen silence, the mountain men left behind a truth simple enough to survive extinction. Warmth is temporary, cold is forever, and that fragile flame between the two is still the only thing that ever made us human. It began with hunger, not the poetic kind, but the kind that gnawed at bones and made decent people dream of bread more than freedom. France, in the late 1700s, was a country dressed in beauty and wrought. Beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, nobles waltzed on polished floors, while the streets of Paris cracked under the weight of starvation. The king, Louis XVI, wasn't cruel by nature, just painfully ordinary in a time that demanded extraordinary. His wife, Marie Antoinette, glittered like a diamond in a famine. Her gowns could have fed villages. Her words, "Let them eat cake," might never have been said, but the people believed them, and that belief burned hotter than any truth. Outside the palace walls, France was splitting in two. The rich feasted, the poor paid. Bread prices doubled, then tripled, and every loaf became a symbol of betrayal. Farmers starved on land they didn't own, paying taxes to men who'd never touched dirt. By 1788, the air itself felt tense, like a held breath waiting to explode. When the harvest failed again, the countryside turned silent with rage. People didn't just want food, they wanted someone to blame. Louis XVI, desperate and confused, called for the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. The third estate, the commoners, made up 98% of the nation, but held only one vote. It was like asking a man drowning in taxes to raise his hand before sinking. They demanded fairness, equality, a voice. When the king refused, they made their own. In June 1789, inside a tennis court in Versailles, they swore an oath to never disband until France had a new constitution. That moment was quiet, but it shook the foundations of monarchy more than any cannon ever would. The king hesitated, the nobles whispered, and the people watched. Rumors began to swirl that soldiers were gathering to crush the revolution before it began. Paris, already starving, was about to erupt. On July 14, 1789, the city decided it had waited long enough. A mob stormed the Bastille, a medieval prison that held only a handful of inmates but symbolized everything rotten about royal power. They tore it apart, brick by brick, their rage louder than their reason. Heads were paraded through the streets on pikes, and the revolution announced itself not with speeches, but with screams. The news spread like wildfire. Across the countryside, peasants rose against landlords, burning tax records and manors alike. It wasn't just rebellion, it was release. For centuries, they'd been told they were nothing, and now they had the proof that nothing could burn the world down. The National Assembly, born from that tennis court oath, began rewriting France. Titles were abolished, privileges erased, and in August 1789 they unveiled the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizens. It promised liberty, equality, fraternity, words so beautiful that even those starving to death could taste hope. But ideals are easy, hunger is not. As the politicians argued, Paris still starved. In October 1789, thousands of women marched from the markets toward Versailles, armed with kitchen knives, broom handles, and fury. They demanded bread, but what they wanted was justice. They broke into the palace, killed the guards, and dragged the royal family back to Paris under heavy rain. The message was clear. The king would no longer live above his people. He would live among them more, not at all. At first, Louis XVI pretended to cooperate. He smiled for the crowds, signed the decrees, and nodded through reforms. But behind the palace walls, plans were already forming. The royal family tried to flee the country in 1791, disguised as servants. They were caught in the town of Varennes, recognized by a coin bearing the king's face. When they were brought back to Paris, the cheers were gone. France didn't see a monarch anymore. it saw a traitor. Meanwhile, the revolution itself was splitting apart. The moderate reformers wanted a constitutional monarchy. The radicals wanted the monarchy gone altogether. The streets filled with new names: Marat Danton, Robespierre, who believed the revolution hadn't gone far enough. They didn't want to fix France. They wanted to rebuild it from the ashes. Pamphlets spread like wildfire, calling for blood and purity, for a republic cleansed of corruption. Paris became a city of whispers, suspicion, and sharpening knives. Outside its walls, Europe watched in horror. Monarchs saw revolution as a disease that could spread, and they decided to quarantine France with armies. Austria and Prussia marched to restore the king's power. The revolution answered with conscription. Suddenly, starving peasants were soldiers, and the cry of liberty echoed over cannon smoke. But liberty is a heavy word to carry when you're barefoot. The early battles went badly, and fear turned inward. The revolutionaries began to suspect betrayal everywhere. The enemy wasn't just foreign. By 1792, paranoia had become policy. The monarchy was suspended, and the royal family imprisoned. The streets of Paris turned red with vengeance. In September, mobs broke into the prisons, slaughtering thousands of suspected royalists in what became known as the September massacres. Blood ran in gutters, and nobody was sure who was innocent anymore. The revolution had begun to eat itself. Then came the moment that could never be undone. The king was put on trial for treason. The verdict was already written before the gavel struck. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI climbed the steps to the guillotine. The crowd was silent as the blade fell, then erupted like thunder. The monarchy was dead. The age of kings in France ended not with a coronation, but with a clean slice of steel. The queen followed 9 months later, her diamonds gone, her hair cut short, walking through jeers to meet the same fate. For a moment, it seemed like justice. The revolution had avenged centuries of tyranny. But revolutions rarely stop when their enemies are gone. Once blood becomes the solution, it starts demanding more. The leaders who once fought together now turned on each other. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, rose as the new arbiters of virtue. They created the Committee of Public Safety, a name that would soon taste like irony. In their eyes, France wasn't pure enough. Every whisper of doubt, every hint of hesitation became treason. Guillotines were raised in every city. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Friends vanished overnight. Even the revolutionaries began to fear the very cause they had created. The reign of terror had begun. In Paris, the air was thick with the smell of iron and dread. Every dawn brought another procession of carts loaded with the condemned. Some had plotted against the revolution. Others had simply failed to cheer loudly enough. The guillotine didn't discriminate. It only counted. Over 17,000 people lost their heads officially, and many more unofficially. The crowd still gathered, not out of joy, but habit. The blade fell like punctuation, regular, mechanical, inevitable. Yet through the horror, something strange happened. The revolution didn't collapse. It survived, fueled by the belief that suffering was the price of purity. France, they said, was being reborn. A new calendar was invented to erase the old world. Churches were closed, priests exiled, saints replaced with reason. Even time itself was rewritten years, counted not from the birth of Christ, but from the birth of liberty. It was madness, but also momentum. The country was remaking itself by sheer willpower and blood. Robespierre believed he could shape virtue through fear. Terror, he said, is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. And for a while, it worked. Enemies fell, armies rallied, and France pushed back the invaders. The revolution was winning, but at a terrible cost. Freedom enforced at the edge of a blade began to look a lot like tyranny wearing a different hat. By the summer of 1794, even Robespierre's allies started to whisper. The man who had promised equality now ruled by execution. When his own name appeared on the lists, the revolution decided it was done being afraid. On July 27, 1794, he was arrested. The next day, he met the same blade he had worshipped. The crowd cheered again, but this time it sounded tired. The terror ended, not with triumph, but exhaustion. France had survived its own firestorm. The monarchy was gone, the church crippled, the aristocracy scattered. But in the ashes, something new was forming. The ideals that began in hunger and chaos, liberty, equality, fraternity, refused to die. They lingered in every street, every field, every scar the revolution had left behind. The people had learned that kings could fall, that power could bleed, that the world could be rewritten if enough hands were willing to hold the pen. But they also learned that freedom without mercy becomes another kind of prison. The guillotine had promised justice. It had delivered silence. And somewhere beyond the smoke and the screams, a new figure was beginning to rise, a soldier with ambition sharper than any blade, a man who would take the chaos of revolution and forge it into empire. But that would come later. For now, France stood in the aftermath of its own rebirth, bloody, broken, and breathless. The people had won, but nobody was sure what victory meant anymore. The streets that once echoed with cries for liberty now whispered a different truth. Revolutions don't end when the old world dies. They end when the new one learns how to live. And in 1794, France was still learning. The guillotine had fallen silent, but its shadow still stretched across France. The revolution had devoured kings and tyrants, friends and enemies alike, and now it stood alone, staring at its reflection in the blood it had spilled. The crowds that once screamed for liberty were quieter now, haunted by the ghosts of men who'd died in its name. Paris smelled not of smoke and fear anymore, but of something stranger, uncertainty. What happens after you burn the world down and realize the fire doesn't know how to stop? The year was 1794. The reign of terror had ended with a final, ironic flourish, the execution of Robespierre himself. The man who had promised virtue through violence had joined the thousands he condemned. For a moment, the country breathed. Then came the silence, the kind that feels like the pause after a thunderclap, powerful, temporary, and waiting to be filled again. In the ruins of ideology, a new government formed, the Directory. 5 men in charge, 5 men trying to steer a nation too exhausted to follow. They promised stability, but France had stopped believing in promises. Corruption bled through the walls of their offices like damp through stone. The people were poorer than ever. The army was restless, and the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, had become words printed on tattered posters. The dream had survived, but the dreamers had died. Still, the world outside was watching. Monarchs who, once plotted France's destruction, now faced something they couldn't ignore, an idea that refused to die, even when its believers did. The revolution had turned France into a furnace, and from its heat, something dangerous was taking shape. Ambition. In the ranks of the army, among the gunpowder and the hunger, there was a man who understood that chaos wasn't a curse. It was an opportunity. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was young, Corsican, brilliant, and broke. The son of minor nobility, with nothing to his name but a uniform and an ego big enough to fill a continent. While politicians argued in candlelit rooms, Napoleon was out in the mud, winning battles that shouldn't have been won. In 1796, he took command of the French army in Italy, a starving, unpaid, desperate force. He fed them on victories. Every town they conquered became proof that maybe, just maybe, France could still rise. His letters home weren't modest. "Soldiers," he told them, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage are admirable, but they earn you nothing, no glory. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." He delivered. In a year, he turned a ragged army into legend. Cities fell before him. Generals twice his age followed his orders. France, broken and directionless, suddenly had a hero. The newspapers called him the savior of the Republic. But Napoleon didn't want to save the Republic. He wanted to shape it. Back in Paris, the Directory stumbled from one crisis to another. Revolts, inflation, assassination attempts. They needed victories to distract the people, and Napoleon gave them exactly that. He marched through Italy like a storm, signing peace treaties with one hand and rewriting maps with the other. Europe began to tremble. France, once the laughingstock of monarchs, was now the monster under their beds. But revolutions don't stay still. They evolve or die. In 1798, Napoleon went further. Egypt. He wanted to cut Britain's empire at its knees and carve his name into history alongside Caesar and Alexander. He didn't find eternal glory, but he found something just as powerful: myth. The campaign was a failure militarily, but a triumph politically. While his ships burned in the Nile, back home he became a legend, the man of destiny, the general who made empires kneel. By 1799, the Directory was collapsing under its own weight. France needed order, and Napoleon offered it wrapped in discipline and charisma. He returned from Egypt like a ghost rising from the dead. The people cheered. The politicians panicked. They thought they could use him. Instead, he used them. On November 9th, 1799, the 18th Brumaire, in the new revolutionary calendar, Napoleon staged a coup. No blood, no mobs, just quiet precision. By the end of the day, the Directory was gone, and France had a new ruler. They called him First Consul. It sounded harmless enough, temporary, republican, safe. But everyone who looked into his eyes knew better. He didn't see France as it was. He saw it as it could be, and he intended to own that vision. He rebuilt the country piece by piece. The chaos of revolution gave way to the discipline of his will. He reformed the laws, created schools, balanced the budget, and replaced slogans with stability. The people loved him because he gave them something the revolution had promised, but never delivered: peace. Yet peace under one man's hand has a price. In 1804, the inevitable happened. In Notre Dame Cathedral, under the gaze of the Pope himself, Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head. The crowd roared. The Republic was dead. The Emperor was born. The French Revolution, born from a cry for equality, had birthed an empire. Some saw betrayal, others saw destiny. The monarchy had been divine by birthright. Napoleon's monarchy was divine by merit, or so he claimed. He made France powerful again. The armies that once defended the revolution now carried it across Europe, not as a message of liberty, but as a banner of conquest. Austria fell, Prussia crumbled, Spain burned. For a while, it seemed like he could reshape the world itself. His soldiers marched with conviction, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" as if liberty and loyalty were the same thing. But every empire built on ambition eventually meets a mountain too high, a winter too long, a field too wide. For Napoleon, that field was Russia. In 1812, he marched east with over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. He planned to teach the Tsar a lesson about power. Instead, nature taught him one about limits. The Russians retreated and burned everything behind them: food, villages, hope. When winter came, it came like a judgment. Men froze, standing up. Horses collapsed mid-step. Out of that grand army, barely a fraction returned. France had gained glory, but lost its soul again in the snow. From there, the spiral began. Europe united against him. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, old enemies, turned allies by fear. In 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, a cage surrounded by sea. But legends don't die quietly. Within a year, he escaped. He returned to France with nothing but his name, and that was enough. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead knelt before him. The country erupted again. The 100 Days had begun. For a brief, impossible moment, the fire of the revolution flickered back to life, this time wearing a crown. But history is ruthless. On June 18, 1815, at a quiet village in Belgium called Waterloo, Napoleon met his end, not with betrayal or assassination, but with defeat. His army shattered under British guns and Prussian steel. He was captured, sent to a far lonelier island, St. Helena, and there, surrounded by endless ocean and fading memories, he died 6 years later, the Emperor of Europe, alone, dictating his story to the waves. When the news reached France, there were no riots, no cheers, just silence. The revolution's final echo had faded. The monarchy returned, fragile and awkward, pretending nothing had happened, but everything had. The old world was gone for good. The idea that power could belong to ordinary people had survived every execution, every battle, every betrayal. It had survived kings, committees, and emperors. It had survived France itself. The French Revolution had begun with hunger and ended with an empire. But its true legacy wasn't a throne or a guillotine. It was the idea that the world could be rewritten, that birthright was not destiny, that nations could start over. The same ideals that bled through the streets of Paris would go on to ignite other fires in South America, in Europe, across oceans. Everywhere people stood and said, "We want to be free." There was an echo of 1789, but freedom, as France had learned, is never clean. It's born in contradictions, liberty enforced by terror, equality crowned with empire. Yet, through all of it, something human endured: the refusal to kneel, the belief that life, no matter how brutal, could be better if someone just dared to imagine it. Centuries later, the revolution still speaks, not through kings or generals, but through the people who remember. The sound of the guillotine may be gone, but its question remains: how much are you willing to sacrifice for the world you want? Because, in the end, the French Revolution wasn't just France's story, it was humanity's. A reminder that progress is messy, justice is costly, and freedom, real freedom, is never handed down. It's taken, fought for, and often paid in blood. The fire that started with bread burned through kings, empires, and centuries. And though it dimmed, it never truly died. Somewhere, in every struggle for equality, in every voice raised against power, you can still hear the faint echo of a crowd in Paris, shouting beneath a torn flag, believing for the first time that the world could change. That was the revolution's real victory. Not the fall of a monarch, but the rise of a question, one that still burns today. What if ordinary people are never ordinary at all?